Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest project you will ever undertake in your life is not your career, not your company, not your family name, not the empire you dream of building. It is yourself. Because every business you touch, every relationship you enter, every achievement you pursue will only rise as high as you have risen within. You can only pour out what you have cultivated inside. And yet, what do most people do? They try to change the world without first changing themselves. They demand results without upgrading the operating system running their own lives. They want a better reality, but they bring the same broken self to every opportunity. That's like trying to build a skyscraper on rotten soil. Doesn't matter how high you stack the steel, it will eventually collapse. Let me tell you something from both neuroscience and from life. Your brain, your mindset, your habits, they are not fixed. Every thought you choose, every action you repeat, every environment you tolerate, those things literally rewire the connections in your nervous system. This isn't philosophy, it's biology. We know from decades of research on neuroplasticity that the brain is malleable. But here's the truth most people avoid. Yes, the brain can change, but it doesn't change it adapts only to pressure. It rewires itself only in response to demand. And if the demand you put on yourself is small, if your standards are low, if your expectations are pitiful, your brain will sculpt itself to match that weakness. In other words, if you tolerate mediocrity, you are training your own nervous system to be mediocre. Working on yourself is not soft, it is not self-indulgence, it is war. And it is the most brutal, honest war you will ever fight, because it is a war with your own excuses, with your own laziness, with your own fear. People ask me all the time, how do I change my life? And I tell them, change yourself first. You want discipline? Stop waiting for motivation and put your body through routines that burn discipline into your muscle memory. You want confidence? Stop reading affirmations and start executing tasks that scare you until fear bows to familiarity. You want influence? Stop shouting opinions on social media and learn to master your emotions so that when you walk into a room, your presence carries weight. That's how you change. But here's where it gets real. Most of you already know this. You've heard it before, you've read books, you've watched videos, you've attended seminars, and still you haven't changed. Why? Because knowing is not the same as becoming. Because information without execution is just entertainment. You've mistaken consumption for transformation. You think by reading a book you've leveled up, but unless you've applied it until your character is different, you're the same person with a bigger bookshelf. Let's dig deeper, because I don't want you to walk out of here with a motivational sugar high that wears off tomorrow morning. I want you to walk out of here with a shift so deep that it rewires how you see yourself. Working on yourself is not an event. It's not what you do once you're inspired. It's the discipline of building a new identity brick by brick until the old version of you no longer exists. It takes more than pep talks. It takes strategy, science, and savage honesty with yourself. There's a principle in neuroscience called Hebbian learning. Neurons that fire together, wire together. What this means is that every time you think a thought or perform an action, you make it easier for your brain to repeat it. Imagine walking through a forest. The first time, you hack through branches and tall grass. The path is rough, exhausting. But walk the same trail every day, and eventually you create a smooth, clear path. That's how habits work in your nervous system. Every time you hit snooze, you carve a path of procrastination. Every time you avoid discomfort, you carve a path of cowardice. But every time you get up early, every time you face the thing you fear, every time you push past resistance, you carve a path of strength. The question is, which paths are you carving? Let me give you a story. Years ago, I met a surgeon. Brilliant man, technically skilled, but his career was stagnant. He couldn't get leadership roles, his colleagues didn't respect him, and his patients didn't trust him. On paper, he was qualified, but here's what I saw. He had poor self-management. He was perpetually late, disorganized, and reactive under pressure. And no amount of surgical expertise could hide the fact that he hadn't worked on himself. He thought his problem was the system or politics or favoritism, but the truth was simpler. The world didn't trust him because he didn't trust himself. After we had a brutally honest conversation, he decided to go to war with his own habits. He started waking up at 5 a.m., journaling his thoughts, tracking his time like it was gold, and practicing emotional regulation exercises to keep his mind steady under stress. Within a year, the transformation was obvious. He was offered the leadership position he had dreamed of, not because his technical skill improved, he already had that, but because his self had improved. This is the hidden truth behind all success stories. Everyone you admire, everyone who has achieved extraordinary results, they didn't just work on their craft, they worked on themselves. Athletes don't just train their sport, they train their mindset, their focus, their emotional regulation. Entrepreneurs don't just study markets, they master their discipline, their resilience, their ability to lead under fire. Artists don't just paint or sing, they wrestle with their doubts, their fears, their self-sabotage. Success is never the result of external work alone. It is the overflow of internal mastery. Now I can almost hear some of you thinking, but working on myself sounds endless. When do I arrive? Let me break your illusion. You never arrive. The moment you think you've arrived, you've already started to decay. Life is in constant motion, and if you're not moving forward, you're sliding backward. The people who thrive into old age, who stay sharp, who keep growing, they're the ones who never stop working on themselves. They reinvent, they adapt, they evolve. The greatest tragedy is not death, it's the death of growth while you're still alive. You see this all the time. People who peak in their 20s and then spend the rest of their lives replaying their glory days. Why? Because they stopped working on themselves. They thought the degree, the job, the one-time achievement was enough. But life doesn't care about your past trophies. Life only cares about the self you bring to the fight today. That's why I tell people, the moment you stop working on yourself, you become irrelevant. And let me tell you something uncomfortable. Working on yourself is lonely. It requires you to walk away from people who don't want to grow. It forces you to face truths about yourself you'd rather ignore. It makes you give up comforts that your weaker self clings to. That's why most people never do it. It's easier to complain, easier to blame, easier to numb yourself with distraction than to sit in the fire of self-transformation. But that's why most people stay average. I once knew a young woman who grew up in an abusive environment. She had every excuse to stay broken, every reason to justify failure, but one day she decided that her past would not define her. She threw herself into therapy, into journaling, into physical training, into education. Every day was a fight with her inner demons, but she fought. Slowly she built self-respect, then confidence, then power. Today she runs her own company, employs dozens of people, and mentors women who are walking the path she once crawled through. That didn't happen because life was fair to her. It happened because she worked on herself until she became someone life couldn't keep down. Working on yourself is also about facing the brutal truth of your biology. Let's talk about dopamine, the molecule of motivation. In the brain, dopamine is not just about pleasure. It's about anticipation, drive, forward motion. But here's the problem. In today's world, we hijack our dopamine systems with cheap substitutes. Junk food, scrolling, porn, mindless entertainment. Each hit gives you a tiny surge of dopamine, but it rewires your brain to expect instant gratification. Then, when it's time to do real work, study, train, build, create, you feel no drive because your dopamine system is already burnt out on low-quality rewards. Working on yourself means taking back control of your neurochemistry. It means fasting from cheap dopamine and retraining your brain to crave progress instead of pleasure. That's not motivational fluff. That's hard science. And here's where discipline enters. People say, I don't feel like doing it. Who cares? Your feelings are the least reliable guide you have. Your biology is designed for survival, not greatness. Your brain evolved to keep you safe, comfortable, away from risk. That's why you resist growth, because your nervous system interprets discomfort as danger. But working on yourself means overriding that primitive wiring, means teaching your brain that fear is not death, discomfort is not danger, and pain is not punishment. Neuroscience shows that exposure to voluntary stress, cold showers, intense exercise, fasting, public speaking, actually strengthens your resilience circuits. You literally reprogram your nervous system to stop panicking in the face of challenge. That's why warriors, athletes, high performers, they seem superhuman. They aren't. They've just trained their brains to stop treating life as a threat. So ask yourself, when was the last time you voluntarily chose the harder path, not because you had to, but because you wanted to grow? When was the last time you leaned into discomfort instead of running from it? That's the litmus test of self-work. The easy choice never changes you, only the hard choice does. Now let me dismantle another lie. People believe working on yourself is selfish. They think I should focus on helping others, giving, serving. And yes, serving others is noble, but let me be crystal clear. You cannot pour from an empty cup. If you are weak, broken, undisciplined, unfocused, your ability to serve is compromised. You think you're being noble, but in reality, you're giving people your scraps. The best gift you can give to your family, to your community, to the world is the strongest, sharpest, most resilient version of yourself. Because that version of you doesn't just give advice, it gives example. An example transforms more than words ever will. I'll give you a personal observation. I've seen leaders who built empires but destroyed their families. I've seen parents who sacrificed for their kids but never modeled strength, leaving their children insecure and fearful. I've seen entrepreneurs who grew companies but crumbled under pressure because they never built themselves. All of these tragedies come back to one root cause. They worked on the external but neglected the internal. They tried to carry others without first building the strength to carry themselves. Working on yourself is the most unselfish act you can commit, because when you rise, everyone around you rises. When you become disciplined, your children inherit discipline. When you become resilient, your team absorbs resilience. When you become wise, your circle gains wisdom. You are not just changing you are changing the gravitational field of everyone connected to you. And here's something few will tell you. Self-work is brutal because it exposes your illusions. You discover you're not as strong as you thought, not as disciplined as you claimed, not as selfless as you pretended. But that's the beauty of it. Once the illusions are gone, you finally see where you actually stand. And from there, you can build something real. Weak people run from that mirror. Strong people stare into it until the reflection transforms. Ladies and gentlemen, working on yourself is not optional. It's not something you do when you find the time. It is the foundation of everything else. And if you neglect it, you will eventually pay the price through broken health, broken relationships, broken dreams. But if you commit to it relentlessly, consistently, without excuse, you will find that life bends in your favor, not because life got easier, but because you got stronger. And that strength is the only real freedom you will ever know.